have an amendment.
Okay, the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
I would like to reinforce what Mr. Lynch was saying. When you talk about freezing these pay salaries, let's think about who these people are. It's researchers at places like the National Institute of Health and that are out there trying to find some cure for cancer. It's some technician figuring out a new way to protect Americans with new devices for homeland security. It's innovators that are going to help us computerize our systems and make them more effective. And I'm particularly concerned, as the gentleman pointed out, that the public servants that work for the SEC, the CFTC, their budgets have been cut back dramatically, yet they really have the ultimate responsibility for safety and soundness of our nation. And when you look at it, you'll have someone figuring out some tax break or some loophole that's being paid 80 times what these regulators are being paid. And a lot of people go to work for public service or for the government because it's something they want to do. They want to make this country better. But we need to help them out. And when you put a pay freeze on people, we really weaken our ability to collect the very revenue that we need to pay for the programs. So when we have IRS technicians and other people, they're up against corporate accountants that are the very best in the business. And they're out there to beat regulations, beat tax regulations, beat the taxes. And when we freeze pays of the people that are there defending the government, defending the people, we really weaken our ability to govern. And our ability to collect revenues, our ability to find cures, our abilities to protect this nation. And I think it's a serious situation. There's something called morale. And if you keep freezing people's salaries, you're really weakening their ability and really their spirit to do the important work that they do for our government. So I yield back to the chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. The gentleman from Brooklyn, New York is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You know, many provisions in this bill would ultimately place an unfair additional burden on federal employees, even though these are the same employees who have already contributed over $60 billion to the nation deficit through a pay freeze for the last 2 years. Asking these employees to contribute an additional 1.5% to their retirement plan represents an immediate decrease in the take-home pay for 2 million hard-working Americans. Federal employees are not paid any better than their private sector counterparts. Like many American households, they are facing a rising health cost, increased living expenses, and supporting spouses and adult children who are unemployed or underemployed, or paying tuition for their children's education. The bill would also shortchange thousands of federal workers who will be denied their annuity supplement that is intended to bridge the gap between retirement and eligibility for Social Security benefits. These employees have made the sacrifice of being paid a lower wage than the private sector because they could rely on the security of a reasonable retirement income. From the federal government, removing the annuity is unconscionable. Let me say, H.R. 3813 is just one other attack against the American worker. Today we are focusing on the federal workforce. Tomorrow we are facing yet another attack on the unionized workforce. Mr. Chairman, I really feel that this is moving in the wrong direction, and it's up to us to correct it. And what we're doing here is not a correction. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Anyone else seek recognition? Hearing none, the bill is open for amendment at any time. Does anyone, the ranking member is recognized for the purpose of offering an amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Sir, you have 3.
What is the number? The first 100,000.
The clerk will designate.
Amendment H.R. 3813, amendment offered by Mr. Cummings of Maryland.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that it be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The amendment I'm offering would exempt employees who earn less than $100,000 per year from the effects of H.R. 3813. As it stands, the legislation before us would result in across-the-board cuts in the take-home pay of 2.3 million middle-class Americans. This is indeed a travesty. We should be building up the middle class, not punishing millions of people in its ranks. If it is inappropriate to raise taxes on millionaires, and we heard this over and over again over the last year or so, if it's inappropriate to raise taxes on millionaires and billionaires in a time of a recession, as the majority has argued, it is also inappropriate to cut the wages of middle-class folks in the time of a recession. Just last week, the majority rushed legislation to the floor to extend the current pay freeze applicable to federal workers for an additional year. Now they want to take even more money out of the pockets of middle-class Americans. The entire time, however, they simply refused, to ask the wealthiest among us to pay an additional penny towards reducing the deficit. For these reasons, I have a very simple amendment. This amendment would ensure that the bill's provisions would apply only to individuals who make more than $100,000 per year. For people making less than this amount, they have already taken a 2-year pay freeze, and they should not have to face additional reductions in their take-home pay while the economic recovery is still fragile. I do not believe we should punish millions of middle-class Americans, particularly Americans who are working to ensure the success of our nation. For those reasons, I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of the amendment.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank him for his thoughtfulness. I will recognize myself to oppose the amendment for a number of reasons. First of all, as we know, the federal workforce, this would be substantially the vast majority of the federal workforce would be exempted. But last, because I know the gentleman has multiple similar amendments, I might say that it is an untenable and unenforceable amendment. If we think about it, somebody starts as an intern or in a low-ranking position. They work for 5, 10, 15 years. They accumulate, let's just say, 1.7%. They pay in the old amount, whatever old system you want to cling to. Mr. Ranking Member, I made $99.50 as a private. Some of that money, de minimis amount, but it's all counting toward my retirement as a congressman. So when I look at how much somebody makes, the problem is you're not dealing with what the person makes in the last 5 years. Many of us on the dais, not a great many, but some, have worked as staffers making less than $100,000, but today we make $174,000. And if our high five are $174,000 and calculated at some other amount or withheld at another amount, it becomes an accounting nightmare. So although I believe that this is well intended as of the next 2 amendments, I think when you look at it from a practical and unified accounting system, if, as I said in my opening statement, if in fact somebody making $50,000, $40,000, $30,000, and I know there's more to come, if we need to pay more to attract and retain them, I'm sure government will adjust. By definition, we will have to. And I already said that I think pay freezes have got to come to an end, and we've got to begin looking at what the legitimate compensation are on an individual or at least a class of worker basis. So although I know these are well-intended amendments, I don't believe that these would be, from an accounting standpoint, administrative standpoint, easy to maintain, consistent, or helpful. But I do believe that the gentleman's earlier statements are good ones, and that is that this committee should look more broadly at the full way that we compensate people and recognize that although this is an effort to reduce the long-term obligation on a consistent basis, that at the end of the day, pay and compensation have to be right-sized, and this committee should, regardless of the outcome today, begin a series of hearings to find out how we reward the workforce in a proper way on a more timely basis. And I recognize the ranking member if he wanted to comment.
Just very briefly. Going back to the whole idea of pay freezes, you know, when I look at what we've been doing with regard to federal employees, I'm getting the impression that the Congress is beginning to look at the federal employee as the source of a piggy, like a piggy bank. Whenever there's a problem, you come to the federal employee, and you know, just consistently chop, and they get poorer and poorer, but their expenses stay the same or get higher, just like everybody else's. And I think one of the things that really concerns me is when you're talking about the whole idea of, you know, that in the future, if we determine that they need to make more money, that we will make those adjustments. You know, I love to think that, but I think that what will happen, that is more likely not to happen, because I think the same arguments will be made that, wait a minute, you can't be going up on wages. You ought to at least bring them down. They're making too much money. The same arguments will be made over and over again, and I don't know whether they will ever get back to where they ought to be. I think we need to be very careful overall with regard to our federal employees, because I can tell you they're taking a hell of a beating, and we may not view this as a beating, but they do. They just see whenever there's some money needed, all right, let's just go run to the federal employees. We don't care whether that lady is a single mother, head of household, making $100,000, maybe $75,000, an attorney who could probably be making more outside, but, you know, let's go to her. Let's get the money from her. At some point, we've got to say, wait a minute, you know, this is just not fair. And somebody mentioned NIH. I mean, I've talked to a lot of those doctors out there at NIH. I mean, they could be making a hell of a lot more money, but yet and still they're sacrificing and giving a lot already. So I understand, Chairman, we could go back and forth on this all night. And then the other thing, I guess, the thing that really concerns a lot of people, Mr. Chairman, is that, you know, when we're asking people to make sacrifices, I believe in my heart that most federal employees would not mind sacrificing if they knew that the millionaires and the billionaires were also sacrificing. I think they would. I think that's the all-American spirit, but they don't see that, and that's what I think that's like rubbing. It's like taking a knife and just sort of just pushing it in their back, and they feel, and this is what I hear in talking to people. So I think we need to keep that in mind too, because one of the things that we cannot measure is morale. You want people to feel good about what they're doing. You want them to feel that we are united. And somebody wrote an article, I think it was Congressman Cleaver, sent a note out today. He said, look at the word united. It does not say, it says united. It does not say untied. I mean, in other words, we're all tied together. We are united. So that means united sacrifice, united benefits. So with that, I yield back, and thank you for your.
I thank the gentleman. Are there any other? The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I wonder if well, first of all, I rise in support of the amendment. I think Mr. Cummings makes some very good points. I was heartened, Mr. Chairman, by your indicating a willingness to have hearings on, what's appropriate by way of compensation. I would simply suggest, wouldn't it be nice if we had those hearings and an in-depth study before this markup, not after the markup? But, Mr. Chairman, could I ask you a question? In your opening statement, I thought I heard you say that the President's well-crafted proposal included a change from high 3 to high 5. I've looked at the President's proposal, and I have found no such proposal. The President's deficit reduction proposal included an increased employee contribution. It included ending FERS annuity supplements for future hires not covered by mandatory retirement. But I have not found any proposal from the White House that would change from high 3 to high 5.
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course.
It's the President's commission, which our presumption, and maybe I'm wrong, is that the President supports his commission, which made that recommendation.
Well, I would respectfully simply suggest to the Chairman that The President has made some very specific recommendations, some of which you have alluded to, or some of which are sort of incorporated in this bill before us. But the President himself, the White House, has not endorsed the high five proposal.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, of course.
Do you have a problem with lowering your benefit or your successor's benefit from 1.7 to 0.7% per year served?
I'm willing to certainly look at congressional benefits, Mr. Chairman, in a fair light. I'm not willing to use Congress's benefits and compensation as a Trojan horse to really get at Federal employees, which is what I frankly felt we were voting on the floor of the House earlier this week.
Would the gentleman yield further?
Of course.
Perhaps what we need to do is to ask the question of what would we support together, and perhaps we can get to some of it. I earlier, if the gentleman doesn't mind, I did speak passionately that I've seen the gaming of the high three, and that's one of the areas that I personally looked at the Commission's report and said, you know, the difference between high three and high five is de minimis unless there's a spike at the end of one's career or for some period of time. And so any savings that is there, for example, and the Commission did recommend it even if not the President, any savings there is a savings based on, and this is future generations, gaming the system or being enriched by a relatively small part of their career. So hopefully there are some items there that you can look at and say, you know what, at least there's a few things that I think are fair, even if they are changes to the existing system. And I hope we can find those here today.
Reclaiming my time, I certainly agree with the Chairman with respect to that. I hope the Chairman can understand how some of us, though he might not agree with us, could look at the fact that we've had so many hearings that seem to be about disparaging public service and Federal employment, and worry, those of us who represent large numbers of those folks, worry about the future workforce. If we continue to disparage public service, if we continue to denigrate the actual contributions of the civilian workforce of the Federal Government, many of whom, by the way, have bravely served side by side with our men in uniform and our women in uniform in Iraq and Afghanistan, who will take their places when they retire? This committee has looked at the fact that 47% of the existing Federal workforce is eligible for retirement over the next decade or so. Who will take their place? If we make public service so unattractive, both in actual compensation and in our rhetoric, that what graduate of a college or university today would actively want that as their career choice? And I hope the Chairman accepts the sincerity of my concern, because it is out of that passion that I speak. And I respect and absolutely take sincerely the Chairman's sincerity of his passion. I hope he will give me similar consideration. And with that, I yield.
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course.
Yield. Just one quick other thing. I just wanted to add on to what the gentleman was just talking about. Social Security is located, the headquarters is located in my district. So I run into these people in the supermarket and every place. And one of the things that's interesting that's happening in Social Security is the workforce is being reduced. So that means that people are working even harder. Add that one to what you were just saying, and that has an impact too. So I'd say my time is out.
I thank the gentleman. If no further members are seeking recognition, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Cummings. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Nay. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. For what purpose does anyone else seek recognition at this time on an amendment? The gentlelady from the district? We can alternate. I'm sure we'll get to them all. The gentlelady is recognized to offer her amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have a sense of the Congress resolution that I hope will be satisfactory to you and to members of the committee.
The clerk will designate.
Amendment offered by Ms. Norton of District of Columbia.
The gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment.
Mr. Chairman, you have led this committee well and justifiably, in my view, on a very serious issue affecting the Office of Personnel Management, and perhaps the most serious issue. And that issue, of course, involves its backlog in processing retirement and pension benefits. This is a very large workforce, and almost every employee will, in fact, enter this retirement system. Currently, OPM has a backlog of 62,000 cases pending adjudication. Worse, the amendment that was just passed almost guarantees that as many as 100,000 could head for the doors very soon. Let me say why drowning this system that is already up to its neck, it should be important to this committee, and why we have gotten to this point. The system that this retirement system is highly paper intensive. We've sat through hearings where we learned of failure after failure to digitize this system. And one of the reasons for those failures is that essentially you have hundreds of thousands of workers who go through a retirement system after having perhaps matriculated through a number of different agencies, having been, you yourself cited, having been a private. That's going to be part of your system. That would be part of it. The person may be on disability. Somehow or the other, all of this has to be brought to bear in deciding what the annuity or pension is. While this is going on, there is great hardship to retirees. They receive interim payments of about 95% of, I'm sorry, about 80 to 90% of what is expected to be the monthly claim. And this happens. These interim payments are for almost 100%, about 95% of the people retiring. This is not a crisis, this is an emergency. And the reason it is so serious is because they are able to process, and by the way, they are increasing their process time from 3 to 3.5 per person daily. Now, just try to imagine how long it will take to get rid of that backlog. My amendment recognizes that this crisis has only deepened, and particularly given the fact that I believe that these workers will head to the door in large numbers. My amendment simply, and it's a sense of the Congress amendment, simply asks that a portion, it doesn't say how much, a portion of the savings that will be generated by this act go towards reducing this, allowing the OPM to reduce this magnitude, this magnitude of problem. We don't know. We've been sitting here talking about possible savings. We don't even know where they will go. Will they go into to pay for the payroll tax? Will they go toward deficit reduction? Will they go toward some unrelated government activity like the unpaid for surface transportation bill? I'm not sure where the money would go, but if this money is going to come out of workers' pay and benefits and pensions, it seems only fair, indeed appropriate, given the crisis in processing retirement and annuity and pensions, that a portion of these funds could go to relieve the mounting crisis, a crisis that this committee has taken the leadership in pointing up and trying to adjust. To a portion of these funds could then go toward helping to reduce this backlog. I think that the amendment is moderate. It obviously would leave it to the administration or whoever seems appropriate to decide what amount is appropriate. But it does seem to me that if you're going to take this money out of the pensions and pay of workers, that it would give them some sense that they were getting something out of it if some of this money could go to this really quite severe emergency in processing retirement benefits.
I thank the gentlelady. I recognize myself in opposition, and somewhat regrettably. This amendment expresses a sense of Congress that a portion of the savings be given to the Office of Personnel Management to help eliminate the claims backlog. And I agree with the gentlelady that that needs to happen. What I would make note of is that we have previously seen OPM waste $27 million in a failed attempt to do just that. Last November, Mr. Ross's Federal Workforce Subcommittee held a hearing to examine OPM's capacity to process retirement claims backlog and process claims in a timely manner. It makes sense to review the impact of OPM's strategic plan for the backlog before dedicating additional resources. OPM just recently briefed the committee and staff on its plan. There are steps the administration can take to improve claims processing without placing an additional burden on the taxpayer. For example, the administration could require agencies to submit accurate retirement records for processing. OPM could work its union to increase case processing standards for employees. And if Director Berry finds additional resources are needed in the short term, I would suggest he look no further than the resources being provided to implement the labor management forms, which to date have shown little evidence of improving productivity to develop multi-state plans under parentheses Obamacare, the Affordable Health Care Act. And I read that carefully because I attended part of that subcommittee, and it was one of those things that you looked and said, geez, it was a good idea. It didn't work. When is it going to work? I would join with the gentlelady in saying that although I'm opposing this particular amendment, the fact is we as a committee need to stay on top of OPM. We need to know when or if the time is right to ensure that funds are made available if requested by the administration. So I will join with the gentlelady in saying if and or when the administration says, here's our plan and here is how we will need to pay for it to help in reprogramming those funds or whatever is necessary to make sure that we get from paper to the modern age. And I would yield to the gentlelady.
I thank Chairman for yielding. I recognize that there may be other sources, and those sources should be tapped. I do want to say to the Chairman, I'm here talking about the backlog. So your list of efficiencies, I would agree with. We are left, though, with a crisis that has developed over many administrations. And this is not a question of blame. Nobody's been able to take care of it. I want to focus on the 62,000 people to whom there may be as many as 100,000 added as they head for the door when they see the kinds of changes that the Congress is making now in pay and benefits. So that what is, in fact, a labor-intensive matter, and I'm not asking here that the funds be given to yet another a computer program to test it out, but to say that if they are raising the number of claims per person, per administrative aid, that they can do in a single day from 3 to 3.5, and we have 62,000 now, and we could have as many as 100,000 coming within the next couple of years. We are dealing with a situation that is out of hand. And while I would accept your upfront from here on, let's do things in a more efficient way, I think we really have to focus in on these people caught in this backlog, not of their own making.
I thank the gentlelady, and reclaiming my time. As I said, if they go from 3.5 to a higher number, or if they successfully come up with a program to computerize, the backlog can be resolved. If the administration makes a request between now and the time this bill moves through the process of the floor and conference with the Senate, I would consider and work with the gentlelady to try to include this kind of appropriate use to try to deal with that. To date, I don't have that from the administration. I'm informed even during the briefing they recently had. And with that, I yield back. And seeing no further questions, no further members seeking recognition, the question is on the amendment from the gentlelady from the Washington, D.C. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. In the opinion of the Chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. And with that, we have 3 minutes and 43 seconds to get to the floor and vote. We will come directly back and continue as soon as the last vote is over. And with that, we stand in recess.